Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I'm Nick Neely, an assistant professor of English writing at Eastern Oregon University, and I'm a faculty member in our low residency MFA program in creative writing. Welcome to this EOU Ars Poetica reading and conversation featuring memoirist Bryce Andrews and his latest book, Holding Fire. There it is. He'll be reading for us tonight, and then he'll be in conversation with our virtual visiting writer for the spring term in the MFA program, Taylor Brorby. As people settle in, I'm going to drop a few links and reminders into the chat. First, we've got one more Ars Poetica event this term. Let me bring up my chat here. And we'd love for you to attend. It'll be live streamed. It's also live on campus. It'll be June 3rd. I'll be in conversation with Allison Cobb about her wonderful book, Plastic, an Autobiography, which won an Oregon Book Award. That's at 5 p.m. The live stream link doesn't exist yet, but we'll make sure that you receive it via email. Get it one way or the other. Stay tuned for that. You can check our visiting writers page for that when it's live, as well as follow us on our YouTube channel, Twitter, and more. Also in the chat are some links to Bryce's book, Holding Fire, and as well as Taylor's wonderful recent memoir, Poison Oil. So as we set off, I also wanted to begin with a brief land acknowledgement, which I acknowledge is an inadequate gesture by far, but a place to start conversation. Many of us are in La Grande, where EOU is located, so I would like to say, we humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land Eastern Oregon University is upon, the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Nez Perce people. We celebrate their traditions, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to this land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeastern Oregon. Thank you. Tonight, I'll briefly introduce Taylor, followed by Bryce. Then Bryce will read for about 20 minutes. Taylor will then pop onto your screen, and he and Bryce will have a conversation for another 25 or 30 minutes. And we hope you'll jump in at any point with your questions. You can drop those into the Q&A box preferentially rather than the chat, so that we know where to find them. And Taylor will weave those into the conversation as he can. First, let me introduce Taylor Brorby, who we're glad to have with us in the virtual capacity this term. He was also a featured guest for an Ars Poetica reading and convo in January. It's good to have him back. Taylor is the author of Poison Oil, Growing Up Gay in a Fractured Land, as well as Crude Poems, Coming Alive, Action and Civil Disobedience, and he's the co-editor of Fracture, Essays, Poems, and Stories on Fracking in America. His work has been supported by grants and fellowships from the National Book Critics Circle and the MacDowell Colony, among other places. And his work has appeared in places like the Huffington Post, Orion, and the New York Times. He is currently the Annie Tanner Clark Fellow in Environmental Humanities and Environmental Justice at the University of Utah, and he will join the creative writing faculty at the University of Alabama this fall. And now to introduce our featured writer for the evening, Bryce Andrews. Bryce is the author most recently of Holding Fire, A Reckoning with the American West. As Alta Magazine writes of the book, Andrews' heartfelt reflection on the American West confronts one of the region's essential paradoxes, that a place defined by innovation and beauty also has a legacy of horrible violence. For the author, the catalyst is inheriting his grandfather's Smith & Wesson handgun, which carries its own awful history. From his ranch in Montana, Andrews turns to neighbors and family as he seeks a new way to live in the West. Bryce Andrews is also the author of Down from the Mountain, which won the Banff Mountain Book Competition and was a Montana Book Award honor title. His first book was Bad Luck Way, which won the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award, the Reading the West Book Award for nonfiction, and the High Plains Book Award for both nonfiction and a debut book. He grew up in Seattle, Washington, and spent a decade working on ranches in the high valleys of Montana. He still lives in Montana, near Missoula with his family. Thanks so much, Bryce, for being with us tonight. Very excited to have you read and chat with Taylor.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to virtually be here, and wonderful to to finish a long day of farm labor with being reminded that I am, in fact, a writer some of the time. So I'm very glad to join everybody tonight. And I guess what I want to do with the first 20 or so minutes here is I want to try, in brief, using a couple of little excerpts to tell the arc of the story that's at the heart of Holding Fire, my most recent book. For me, this is a really personal book, and it distills about 15 years of working and living on ranches in Western Montana and immersing myself in that life. So this is a book about ranching. It's also a book about blacksmithing. It's about my family's story on this continent, which reaches back to the Pilgrims and the Plymouth colony. It's about my experience with an inherited gun and the damage done to American society by our love for firearms. Perhaps most of all, it's about the urgent, necessary work of separating the concepts of violence and freedom. In other words, super light stuff, and obviously a book that will ruffle no one's feathers. To understand this story, you have to wrap your head around the fact that from the beginning, I wanted very badly to be a cowboy. I'm just going to read you a really short piece from the beginning of the book. My godfather, Pat Zentz, once told me that it took 3 generations to create a complete rancher. This wasn't precisely bragging, because Pat was only the 2nd generation of his family to graze the bench and coulee country near Billings. Perhaps he said it because he was proud of his sons. More likely, he said it because he considered it a fact and was in the habit of telling me the truth. Here's a story. At a branding, a large community affair, a kid not more than 8 walks in among the crush of ropes and horses and squalling calves, and nobody calls him back. Little straw hat jammed low, he vanishes in dust amid hard-hoofed creatures sure to stamp the life from him without meaning to. He's gone among the legs of horses and the running, working, shouting men of his own and neighboring clans. Then he appears, hat gone, bent knee jammed into the neck of a prone calf. He tilts back as a man leans in with the red-hot iron, and the calf screams and smokes and thrashes. When the branding's done, the kid lets the creature bound off. He stands, beating dirt from his clothing, with thin arms. The man, reaching down, finds the hat in the dirt, puts it back on the boy's head. Jesus Christ, one fence-leaning oldster tells another. You see him mug that heifer calf? There's his father's boy. Got grit in him like a dry creek in August. They breed him that way up here. Do you envy that boy? For much of my life in agriculture, I did. I coveted that childhood of rawhide and dust, considering it the opposite of my lot in Seattle. It was a grass is greener longing turned upside down. I wanted drought instead of deluge, hard in lieu of soft. I wished to have grown up in a scrum of cattle and horses, and to have been well started toward manhood, while my town-bred school fellows were still petting hamsters. As I allude to there, all that buckaroo stuff was not my lot as a child. I was born in Seattle, a thing which I'm now quite proud of, to a father who was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, and to an artist mother, a photographer. I was a well-loved, round-faced boy raised in an atmosphere so devoid of guns that the first time somebody put a toy pistol in my hand, I held it up sideways, and I looked through what I presumed to be the viewfinder and framed a little scene and went click. Both of my parents loved that story. It could not possibly make them happier, nor could it do any better job of explaining the pacifism of the environment that I grew up in. But I was really determined, and I really loved what I understood of the West and its mythology. And so I made my way eastward over the Cascades toward the American West. I came out here where I live now, and I worked. I worked as a ranch hand in valleys near Yellowstone, and I worked my way up to managing those same ranches. I worked until I got the scars and the crow's feet that I had come looking for. And midway through that process of self-inflicted, willful callousing, I received a notable gift. My father came out from Seattle, and he brought with him, his father's Smith & Wesson revolver. It was a beautiful gun, and I treasured it, and I used it. I carried it against fear and bears and darkness. I used it to kill cattle that I couldn't cure. It became much more than a tool to me. And for a while, I loved that revolver. I particularly loved the fact that it connected me to a tradition, and it placed me in a line of proudly Western men. But after a time, I began to find myself troubled, deeply troubled about the power that gun and other guns exerted over me, and the degree to which they were coming to be central in my life. And I remember something that a rancher friend told me around that time. He was a guy who was given to like the sort of pithy witticisms that sound really good coming out of a weathered face. I remember this guy said to me, he goes, a guy buys a backhoe and everything starts looking like it needs to be a hole. And it just stuck in my head. And whenever I used my grandfather's gun after that, I thought about it. I thought about the way our tools shape us and how they tempt us. And as I began to think more and more about that, I became more disturbed about the way that I found myself clinging to that gun. I became disturbed by how often I found or imagined uses for it. I certainly did not like the way I kept it close or came to regard it, as I think too many people in America do today, as a talisman and a totem and an essential part of who I was. On some very basic level, I didn't want that weapon or any weapon defining me. This is the crux of it, right? At a certain point, that gun began to feel really heavy in my hand because it began to feel like an embodiment, an actual objectification of certain aspects of ranching, and in fact, broader ways in which we live and think about the American West. It wasn't so much individual acts of violence, because I continued to have to use the gun for legitimate things, as the fact that a particular form of violence against Native ecology and Native cultures in a place that I loved was braided into the culture and the life of the work I had chosen and the West. So I'm going to read to you a short excerpt from the time in the book when I'm basically thinking about some of that stuff that I was just describing. When the revolver first came into my hands, I felt history vibrating in it. The weapon was alive with affinities. It shone with power. I thought of the leather cartridge belt around my waist, and I thought it tied me to a line of men who were strong, who endured, who strove against a wilderness, who broke the world into shapes that pleased them. To carry that gun and be counted among such men was my inheritance as a settler's son. For years, I embraced the bright side of that inheritance without looking at its darkness. I have no excuse for this. My mother, the black and white photographer, taught me better. She taught me that only half of a thing's true shape is shown by reflected light. The other half is shadow. To illustrate this, she took me to look at Puget Sound. Stirred by a light wind, the water was a chaos of wavelets, each one of them half ink, half mercury. An artist's eye sees that negative space, she told me. It finds the dark places and the cracks. She passed those secrets to me, expecting me to remember, but when I first saw the shining West, I forgot. I canonized people who carved hard livings from rough country, enshrined roping, herding, and breaking ground with big machines as noble labor, and considered Montana-born cowboys as a native aristocracy. I strove to emulate those Western sons, seldom looking critically at them or my chosen life. But I am my mother's son, born with her eyes. Eventually, I developed doubts. They started small, as a suspicion that something was wrong with the way I treated livestock. Every cow, studied closely, has her own way of being in the world. It's easy to ignore this while looking at 200 head of line-bred Black Angus cattle But the truth is that even a herd like that is made of individuals. Cows have preferences and affiliations. They nurture alliances and vendettas, despite the fact that we have spent millennia nudging their species toward heft and dullness. Nature is incorrigible that way. Most cowboys I worked with did not recognize this or weren't willing to discuss it, beyond warning me when a bull was on the fight. They'd say "good mama" to a cow when she licked a newborn clean and stood quietly to suckle. 2 days later, they'd cuss her as a mean old rip for menacing them when they came to tag and castrate her calf. Very seldom did they weigh the traits together and see the animal as she was. This willful blindness is unsurprising, because the modern large-scale stockman's work, raising livestock to be killed for strangers, is psychologically burdensome. It is easier to haul a load of calves to slaughter if you do not know one animal from another. Looking away is meant to protect us, but it doesn't work. Instead, it precludes our learning from animals and comprehending the depth of our entwinement with them and the land. Absent this bond and knowledge, it is hard to avoid becoming lonesome, vengeful, and destructive. Much of this destruction is visited on plants and soils. The overall impression that I got, and still get, when I scan most of the pastures along any rural highway in Montana, is of increasing exhaustion. The land, which is capable of feeding people and perpetually renewing itself, has been worn down and out by our misuse. And there's something else. Many of the ranchers I worked with were as tired as their fields. They griped about the slim margins of their chosen work, the cost of fighting weeds and predators, the rising price of diesel. They spoke like the best times had come and gone. The way they talked made clear that something within them was wearing thin, eroding with the soil. Too many of them looked and acted like veterans of a long military campaign. Soldiers kept too long in the field. And this is no coincidence. For 200 years, their way of life has been at war with the ecology of the American West. I do not mean this figuratively. A proper firefight has been going on since settlers crossed the plains. On one side of the battle lines were the indigenous animals, plants, and people of the place we now call West. On the other were herders, drovers, and sod-busters bent on clearing space in which they and their kept species could thrive. The settlers accomplished this with axes, plows, and bullets. Above all else, bullets. One further little passage here. We're getting it wrong in this beautiful, ravaged place. Not just ranchers, but every modern American, still operating within the traditions and myths that brought us here. Over and over, we find a lovely valley, shoot it through the ecological heart, grind its bones to dust, and pour the foundation of an edifice less interesting than what existed before. This approach was criminal when we turned it on tribal nations. It was criminal when we rubbed out animals we classified as vermin. It remains criminal now as we scalp prairies that overlay bitumen, gut mountains for their last rich veins, and subdivide fertile prairies that might otherwise sustain us. For years, I could not understand why we kept at such work. I thought of our culture as a stumbling beast that caused accidental damage, like a blindfolded elephant. I could forgive an elephant for making a mess, but I'd like to catch the bastard who put the blindfold on. I have become less charitable. Now I refuse to accept the premise that we, individually or collectively, know not what we do. All of that is to say that I came to a point, kind of a breaking point, honestly. I mean, I remember I came to this very dark winter where the gun was working in a profoundly self-destructive way on me, and that had everything to do with the ways in which that tool and the violence it opened doors to tied into the history of the American West and my place in it. I noticed that pattern of destruction in Western history, and I wanted so badly to diverge from it. And I'm going to tell you now very briefly what I chose to do. I fantasized for a long time about getting rid of my grandfather's gun, but I had this kind of bind that I was in, right? Because the first thing that you think of when you want to get rid of a gun is, in the American West, you're never more than 30 minutes from a gun store. Why don't I just take it down and sell it? Why don't I turn this gun into, $600 to $800 and, go have a party? The problem with that is I couldn't trust that it wouldn't go into hands that were less thoughtful than mine. And I had a couple of interactions with people at gun stores that made me completely certain that I wouldn't be parting with it that way. And then I thought about destroying it. I thought about taking it out to Puget Sound and dropping it in the water. Thought about dropping it down a crevasse in a glacier right above the farm here. But that, to a great extent, felt like vandalism to me. And by entertaining those thoughts, I came to understand that I didn't want to part with everything that I had been given, but I wanted to break with the portions of my inheritance that felt destructive. So what I settled on doing is remaking the gun. The only problem is I had no clue how to do that. So it's very fortunate for me that people like Jeffrey Funk and places like his New Agrarian School exist in the world. And if you guys have never heard of Jeffrey or the school, I would highly encourage you to look him up. Jeffrey's one of the most accomplished, interesting blacksmiths probably on the continent. And he runs this amazing school in Big Fork where he teaches people the art and craft of working with metal. Jeffrey and his wife, Betsy, completely opened their lives, their shop, their home to me. I talked to them about the project, the gun, my work as a rancher, and they said, yeah, we'll do that here. And then they proceeded to give me about a month of their lives, which is more than anybody could ask for, and refused to take any sort of payment for it. So for a month, I would go up there and we would practice. We'd work on blacksmithing processes that would be necessary to take a complex object like a revolver, which is into something else that was solid. We worked on this until I was proficient enough that we could undertake the process of turning this revolver into a tool. And what I chose to do is turn it into a tool that's for planting trees. A tool specifically built for rewilding pastures like the ones on our farm here in the Jocko Valley. I'd say one thing further before closing with a little reading from the end of the book. And it's that at the same time when I was talking through a lot of these practicalities with Jeffrey about the gun's transformation, I was having a parallel conversation with another friend, Jermaine White, who is a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, whose reservation I live on, the Flathead Reservation. And Jermaine used to be the outreach and education director for the tribes. So she was in a position of speaking to non-tribal people about the intentions and priorities of the tribes a lot. She and I became friends about a decade and a half ago, and she's always been a force of generosity in my life. And we started having these conversations about this gun and the ways in which that inheritance was freighted and some of my thoughts about what to do with it. And I just want to share two thoughts of Jermaine's from that conversation, because I want to make sure that every single person hears them, that I can shout at them. The first thing she said to me, and she said it enough times for me to get it through a head that had become pretty thickened by ranching, is that the proper and healthy relationship between people and a place is one of gratitude and reciprocity, right? And she distinguished that, I think, notably from sustainability, right? Sustainability, in her way of thinking about it, is about how much can you take from a place without destroying it, right? Like, what's the sustainable yield of a forest? She was talking about something that I think is more fundamental, which is cultivating a truly reciprocal relationship in which a place cares for the people and the people care for the place. That, of course, is nothing new. That's something that's been done for thousands of years on this continent. The other thing Jermaine said that stuck in my head, and really one of the things that pushed me over the line, because it was very difficult for me to decide to unmake this thing, this beautiful revolver, this thing from my grandfather. But something Jermaine said to me really stuck with me. She said, one, fire is only destructive in a European cosmology. To us, it's a tool of renewal. The other thing she said is, listen, on the most basic, simple level, it's our responsibility, all of our responsibilities, to make sure that the coming 2 centuries are better than the last 2. And what she meant by better is more just and more ecologically whole. And when I heard her say that, I understood very clearly that the affinities of the tools we use, the things we carry, the things we keep close, they can either help or hinder our ability to do that with the next 2 centuries. And that is kind of what kicked me over the edge and let me put my grandfather's gun into a fire. Since we remade that tool, I've been reforesting and rewilding a pasture on our farm. I think that I chose a uniquely Anthropocene moment in which to undertake this work, because no sooner did we start this planting project, my wife and I, than we endured the hottest summer on record. We planted under just a merciless sun, under a sky that was choked with forest fire smoke for most of the summer. And we also planted while Jillian was pregnant with our first child. I want to read you the last 2 pages of the book, which are basically a letter meant for my daughter. And then I look forward to talking with Taylor a little bit. One night at our kitchen table, my parents described the time before I entered the world. They recalled the last weeks of pregnancy, the feeling of something immense and unstoppable reaching its dramatic conclusion. My mother said, all of a sudden, I realized that what I thought of as the end was actually the beginning. Ever since, I've been thinking about you. You. The word is a drumbeat and a heartbeat for me now. While Jillian, your mother, creates you day by day, I've been watering small, wild plants and considering the time and place you will enter. If all goes well, you will be born as I was, following the darkest part of winter. You will first glimpse life as everything breaks bud. Perhaps that means that you, like me, will have spring's green up woven through the depths of your mind. I would be pleased to see you inherit such hope, to believe that the world should improve and flower as time goes along. It is the truth, even if things go otherwise. If we raise you as we mean to, you may well grow up loving this farm, the valley, and the hard-used, enduring montane west. You'll live according to its seasons. It will feed you and be a true home. But one day, as you grow into your mind, you will notice that history infects the present. In your pale inner wrist, the blue blood visible under your skin, you'll mark an inheritance you never sought. You'll face the knowledge that some of your ancestors, present since the start of North America's European colonization, have been party to episodes of cruelty and destruction, so fantastic as to mock the ways in which those long-dead forebears might have been wise, kind, or gracious. If this unsettles you, it is because your heart is good and your mind sharp. Unsettled is a fine, strong word. It can carry you beyond guilt into the realm of action. I'm sure of very little where the future is concerned. I do not know, for example, whether we, here in the West and elsewhere, will stay thralls of cultural and ecological violence or turn unexpectedly toward justice and repair. I offer no predictions, but I want to tell you something before we are in the world together, before I become your father with many flaws. I was born with hope and have it still, even as the mountains burn. I had it even when my grandfather's gun was heaviest in my hand. History is an hourglass tapering to us, to you. The past must come through us to reach the future. Because of this, what we embrace will endure. What we resist will begin to fade slowly from being. Since I remade the revolver, I've been convinced that you and I, alive, occupy a position of immense responsibility and creative power. There is hope in a hammer swing, though the past is stubborn metal. On the farm, as faster growing trees rise beyond the height of a human eye, the planting will hide its heart from view. It will fill with life. Every morning this time of year, 3 white-tailed bucks rise from the tallest grass at sunrise and feed on what I've planted. Most days I shout them off with instructions to wait a year. Sometimes, though, I let the creatures browse. In a decade, those deer will be hidden. No concern of mine at all. The spade I someday, but the grove, this small forest growing daily more complex and whole, belongs no more to you than me or the deer that come at night. You can enter, of course. I made a sitting place, hauled 2 boulders in and left them flat side up. You can visit always. Come in the flush of spring or in midwinter when ponderosa bark and leafless dogwoods glow orange and red against deep snow. At the end of summer, come after a long-awaited storm to feel the great loosening peace of 1,000 trees drinking. Stand in the grass while rain soaks down to the roots that hold us here. Ever since I grew to see the American West clearly, I've been racked by the fact that each generation, since the coming of my ancestors, left the place worse off, more ecologically fragmented, less just than they found it. It struck me as wrong, this relentless tearing at the fabric of home. I want your story to diverge from that past. It already has a different start. You will be born on a farm that holds more wild life with each passing year. You will be raised knowing from the enduring example of the Salish and other native tribes that human beings can live thousands of years in a place without ruining it. Your children, if you have them, will play among many trunked alders and pines so thick that outspread arms cannot encircle them. You can show them arched black openings in the brush and tell them how the bears use hidden trails. You can rest together, sheltered from the sun. They will like that, I think. In the world that's coming, they will need shade. Thanks.
Oh, Bryce, thank you for that journey you brought us on. I'm glad you read that so I didn't have to. Getting that last sentence just can level a person. It's so profound and insightful and so true to what we know about the present and the present that is to come. I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you. I mean, I've been following your books ever since they've been coming out. So this is a pure treat for me. When Nick had said, "Oh, Taylor, for the last event, who do you want to be in conversation with?" I said, "Oh God, get that Andrews guy on the phone and see if he'll say yes to me." And where I kind of want to begin, because in some ways, you know, I grew up just east of where you're talking about in Western North Dakota. And I've often thought Montana, that big, beautiful state I like to pick on, has had a certain predilection for drawing straight white men from Michigan who usually write about fly fishing and hunting to the state. But you are in a different tradition. You grew up west of Montana and you moved east. And from what I have to assume is that your childhood eye was trained on the subtleties of green, and just even what that has done to you over your life of going east to Montana since childhood, visiting your godfather's ranch and in that big dry area, and now living a little west of there and in just north of Missoula. What has that been like to move from a landscape where everything, you know, even the bark in Washington is green, to now in a browner palette? What has that been like for you as a writer?
Well, you know, the truth of the matter is so few of us appreciate what we grow up with. I think, you know, because if you had asked me what color it was back then, I probably would have said gray.
Sure.
Right? Because gray is the sky, gray is the rain,
sky.
Gray is the leaden surface of Puget Sound. When I look at it now, I see the beauty of the place where I grew up. And in fact, you know, I'm eager actually to write about it someday soon. But for me as a kid, I mean, there was the myth of the West. There was all the cowboy mythology that gets laid on us from a very early age. And, you know, my mother bears a lot of responsibility for this because she, you know, she had a dark room in our basement and she had like plastered it with posters from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Yes.
And so that just really got in there pretty much under everything else, you know, this sort of sensibility about, you know, Western archetypes and art. But I will say, you know, it goes beyond just being a sucker for myth. I mean, I remember when we would go east in the summer, which we did every summer because my father loved to fly fish, which is what, you know, that's the gateway drug for so many people with Montana. We would drive across the Cascades, and I remember we'd get out to Eastern Washington, and it was as if everything that ever felt claustrophobic to me was pushed back in an instant. right? The horizon was broader. There was a simplicity and an austerity to the landscape. What I thought of as a simplicity at the time, and what I thought of as austerity at the time, that just really spoke to me. And then if you add on top of that, we would drive out to Pat and Susie Zentz's ranch. And Pat Zentz is amazing, third generation rancher, but also a experimental, interesting sculptor who made these sculptures that translated, wind speed and topography into sound. So he would build these creek translators and stringed instruments and percussive instruments that would play high tensile fence. So I would plunk down on this ranch, right? And I would look around and see not only this place where people were looking with a really keen eye at the landscape, but also I had this sense of tremendous personal freedom, of liberty to go where I wanted, to undertake labor and fun thing, to do things that you couldn't do as a kid in the city. So for me, everything was pushing me this way. And so it really felt like I couldn't do anything except for come out here as soon as I, attained my majority or whatever.
Well, and what you're talking about a sort of rancher artist and a way of viewing the world reminds me of something you had shared with us all earlier. That was one of the favorite sort of micro moments you had for me. I mean, I grew up, I should have been conceived with a gun in my parents' hand. I mean, it was like bang, bang, shoot 'em up country, very different from your childhood. I mean, one of my first gifts as an 8-year-old was a Chipmunk 22 and things like this. So these are very familiar things to me and problematic. And one of the things I admire about this book is how it takes on such a powerful force, not only in the West, but in the culture in which we're suffering through right now. We all know that we're living in daily through mass shootings and our obsession with being heavily armed. The micro moment I want to ask you about is what you had already referenced about holding up the toy gun as if it were a camera. And I thought that's so incredible because without saying in the book, you don't use the word lens, but to my reading mind, that's exactly what you're doing, that this handgun that you've inherited is a lens through which to see your life, your family's life, the life and history of the American West. And I had a late teacher who would often talk about these things as like a dense fact, like a handgun isn't just a handgun, but it's a tool, but it's also a sex symbol, as you're saying, with the good and the bad and the ugly. And they're just different ways of peeling that fact back. It felt like that's what you were doing in this book, but I'm wondering, in the construction of a book like this, were you thinking about angles of which to examine the gun, or was it like, God, just let me write a story from beginning to end? Or I think with any of the MFA students who are listening, it would just be helpful to get into your brain and process a little bit about that.
That's a great question. For me, writing something like this is a very circular process. In that I tend to not process or consider things with the depth that you just described. I'm driven to write about things and then endlessly rehash and revisit. And I think it's through that process that facts accumulate their density, and that I come to understand where I need to put more pressure in the narrative. And I mean, I honestly think that part of what separates most people who are doing really interesting written work from people who aren't is, quite honestly, just obsessing about it more and spending more time staring at it until it reveals some other thing. Because I'm always struck by these people who, like, I have a couple writer friends who will remain nameless, who have the kind of people who, like, when they die, you can publish their papers, right? And everyone will be like, there went a writer, not me. If anybody ever gets inside my journals, they're just going to be, look at the demented ramblings of a middle schooler, because that's what it is the first time.
Yeah.
And so all that is, I guess, my way of saying that, like, working on something like that, I mean, to your point, to your example, that memory is indelible for me. And it's indelible because my parents have told it to me so many times. I actually don't remember it myself. I remember their account of it. And sometimes that's a wonderful thing. That's an indicator that it meant something, that it meant something to them, and that it's probably a place where meaning lies. Also, I just always thought there was humor in it. And a story like this, I actually sometimes have a hard time reading from this book because humor is a big part of my life.
Yeah.
I like to laugh, and I like to see the brightness even in dark things. But this book dealt with some heavy shit. And so for me, those little moments where you can see the innocence of a child picking up a gun like that, or you can see the fact that there are certain things about American gun culture that aren't just scary, but they're also ludicrous. Those things to me are interesting and worth writing about.
I'm so appreciative of what you're saying, because I think it's helpful to be reminded of that during the time in which we live. We have to have humor, otherwise the bastards have got us. And I think of at the end of the book, when you're first using your newly made tool and you swing it, and that's like, well, and it promptly sliced open by Shid, I thought that would be typical for me too, and to see it's not a finished product, that this tool might be somewhat cumbersome in the owner's hand at that point. It helps what you're saying with a very weighty topic make us feel human in the story that we're receiving, I think, as well. And there's something I want to ask you about here too that you had brought up earlier. There were moments in your book where I thought, okay, we're breaking away from some narrative here. Bryce is kind of singing his high note in a different way, is how I describe it, of sort of like, tell us the insight or things like this. This is about halfway through your book. I'm going to read your words back to you, Bryce, just to get a sense of this. This is after you had already talked about us scalping the prairie and things like this, something that's very important to me, my home landscape. But you say, for a long time, I wondered why we did all this. That's the destruction ecologically of the continent and of peoples, of course. Now I understand, and it terrifies me. We do it because we are lazy. We do it to stay comfortable. We do it because recent history is hard to look on. We do it because shuffling downhill to ecological and moral perdition is, for the moment, easier than facing an upward climb. So, my Michael Silverblatt bookworm question for you is, given that, what are we as writers and artists supposed to do? Or why write stories then, given the weight of everything we're in and what's to come?
Well, I think here's my answer to that. A personal story, and one that is told charitably, by which I mean one that does not seek to make a devil out of a person who doesn't agree with you. I think that's potent medicine in a time when there are great forces that work upon us to alienate and separate us. I feel funny saying this in response to the passage you read, because that's about as preachy as I get.
Sure.
But for the most part, that passage notwithstanding, and I went back and forth a lot. I'm glad you found that passage, because it is a different, it's something different, and I felt that it needed to be in there. But for the most part, this story is not prescriptive.
Right.
It does not tell people what they should do with their grandfather's revolvers. It doesn't even tell them how they should live in the American West, I think. It simply is a story about wrestling with issues that are commonplace, that are epidemic, in perhaps pandemic. Wrestling with issues that we all wrestle with. And to the degree that a story like that is instructive and inspires people to think differently about their own lives and their relationship to their tools and their inheritances, to me, that's, I think, where the utility in it lies. And And on some very basic level, I want to be a useful writer, right?
Yeah.
I don't just want to write something that I think is beautiful or that somebody else does. I want to write something that makes people think differently about their world.
There's a way in that early in the book, I mean, Nick even kicked off our conversation with this. And as my joke was to the three of us earlier, being someone who's thoroughly institutionalized, we have these sort of hollow land acknowledgments. And early, the very first thing we get after your title page is an author's note. And for me, I thought, are we in a time where we need and or are expected to write those? However, there's more to say here. In your book, what makes it different than maybe what we get in land acknowledgments, you pull that through. It's not just, hi, here, I'm virtue signaling, let me show you that I understand the land upon which I write and out of which these stories arise. We get examples of the narrator doing work in the community where he lives and trying to understand deeper senses of history. But I'm wondering what is being asked of nonfiction writers who are taking on complex topics, especially as they intersect with issues around race. I mean, there would be writers and, Bryce, that would say, well, Mr. Andrews, stay in your lane, only write about, that which but you're intersecting in an interesting way that the tool you've inherited has wrought great violence upon the continent and in the specific area in which you live. But I'm just curious, with all my jabbledy-goop that I'm now throwing at you, I was so struck by that author's note, because at first it made me catch my breath, which is maybe a great thing as a writer, as a reader to experience. But then I saw your craftsmanship work through that. It wasn't just a plop it down like it so often is in modern culture.
Right. There are a lot of interesting questions in there. I think, one of them, I think the first thing that I would say is that was the last thing I wrote in the process of making this book.
Yeah.
And the way it begins is by talking about how I can see these structures that are essentially dissolving. And I can see them right now from where I'm sitting talking to you. You can see these barns that are slumping in on themselves. And for me, that is not only an acknowledgement of the indigenous history of this landscape. It's also an acknowledgement and a nod to the fact that there's a depth of history here that's not visible unless somebody calls it out for you. The other thing that I would say is that I was just talking, actually, Jermaine, who I mentioned, she and I were talking actually yesterday about land acknowledgements, because she was saying that she was so frustrated with, she had gone to a function that was hosted by the University of Montana, and the person who was doing the land acknowledgement mispronounced a bunch of the tribe's names. And it was just this really, it was a difficult moment for her. And she was saying, I mean, like anything else, unsurprisingly, there are acknowledgements and acknowledgements, right? And you can tell when something is done out of a depth of knowledge and a legitimate curiosity and gratitude and sense of apology. And so, I mean, I think it's important both to do these things and to truly intend them. I live on a reservation, so for me to write about this place without writing both in an acknowledgement and in the body of the text about the tribal history is basically not doing my job as a writer, a writer of nonfiction.
No, totally. And thank you for that. I mean, that resonates so deeply with my own sensibilities. One thing I also was thinking about as I was reading your work, knowing that in your day-to-day life, it sounds like, from what I understand, Bryce, is that you're practicing much more agricultural. Well, you're working on a farm. You're not on a big ranch, which we often think of in big sky country. In some ways, when I was reading through sections of your book, I was reminded of my dear and cantankerous friend Wendell Berry, who writes in a very different part of the country than where you are. But in some ways, it seems you're working in a very similar vein. I mean, you're of course much younger than Wendell and an updated version of some of his ideas, but I'm thinking of being rooted, of caring for a place, of thinking how a place can speak to us. The final 2 pages of the letter that you read to us so beautifully to your daughter about hoping what the future can bear. I'm wondering how you think that story, because to my mind, it seems so different than the history of ranching in the West, to be practicing farming and to be thinking about what a landscape needs, what the animals that pass through, as you've written, have needed, how to document that story in a time of radical change.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So where we are here on our place, we call it a farm, but we do still raise cattle. That's actually most of what we do. But the approach, as you mentioned, is totally different, right? I mean, when I was working on these larger ranches, and some of them were very well run, but the presumption was always that the needs of the cattle were preeminent. That was the main thing and always would be. I think what's interesting about our place is that we're approaching the idea of making a living on the land, I think, more holistically. We're saying, let's look at what we need to get out of this so that we can keep, paying the bills and making ends meet. And through that process, we've kind of come out to this idea. It used to be like, how many cattle can I put on this ranch, right? What's sustainable? How much grass can I take off this place? Now, increasingly, we think about things really different. We think like, how few cattle can we have on this place and make it work for us? We also have, started growing, berries. We have this big U-pick raspberry patch. So we're doing other things besides cattle. But, the work of ranching is still very much a part of my life.
Yeah.
But I look at it really differently, and I have different goals with regard to what this place will look like in 50 years. It's a complicated thing. There's so many people who depend on agriculture for their livelihood in this landscape, and transitioning to something that's, can last longer here, I think is going to be a complex, long process. I know that to be true.
Well, and it's so interesting to, meet you at this point in your life too, to be thinking about what can I anticipate 50 years from now? What am I investing in terms of the trees that I'm planting, the saplings that you're using your tool for, and just to be thinking long term in that way, which goes against so much of modern American culture. I'm still keeping my eye on, I'm trying to give you all some good Lutheran guilt. I'm seeing no questions in that Q&A, so shoot me some. But Bryce, there's a point early on, maybe in the first third, where I got really worried about the narrator, and you had referenced this earlier about sort of a dark season of life where it almost seemed that the firearm took on its own magical realism quality in some ways of kind of almost taunting or tempting the narrator. And I'm reminded of, again, anyone famous from North Dakota was only passing through, Lewis and Clark were only passing through Theodore Roosevelt. But Theodore Roosevelt would say something like, black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough, of thinking, if you're busy and moving quickly, depression or suicidal ideation will not catch up with you. And I'm wondering, because I can't get over how much weight is given this firearm in this narrative in the best sense. I feel this is a living, breathing menace that then has been resculpted into something hopefully sustaining and beautiful. But I'm just wondering what it's like as a writer that for me, with our narrator, felt like the darkest moment potentially. And it's like there are other scary things when the man's walking up the road firing off his firearm. I was scared then, of course, too. But in that personal way, for the narrator, I was very worried that this gun was going to get him, even though I know, well, the person had to live to write this book. But what was that like for you to go there? I think sometimes in memoir, what I've so appreciated about yours is it's not falling in some of the vain memoir often can be trauma narratives or addiction. You're giving us another way to think about our stories in memoir, but there's risk in that moment for the narrator. And what was
Right.
that like to write it?
It was very difficult to write it. And I was really reluctant to write it because prior to undertaking the task of writing about it, I hadn't actually really processed it or understood it for the thing that it was.
Yeah.
Because part of the code, is that you don't admit to suicidal ideation. You don't admit to the darkness that creeps in those moments when you're low and you're thinking about the injustice or violence that's braided into the life you picked. So for me to go back and write about that stuff, it was difficult. It was intentional. I understood that to tell this story thoroughly, I would have to tell that part of it. Yeah, and that became more clear as the other chapters came into focus around it. But man, I didn't like doing it. But afterward, I felt a sense of catharsis, or I felt that I had engaged with it and processed it more than I had in the preceding decade. And so it was a really useful thing. But I'm by nature, I've not been given to. It's a weird thing to say as for somebody who writes a lot about their life, but like I have a complicated relationship with like being confessional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's hard. Perfect. I want to ask one more thing about process and structure, just to get it in for any future writers amongst us or people practicing. Your book interweaves these, what I had been reading fully through, and I might have misread them, the italicized portions as kind of documents to your daughter, though it might only be the last one, honestly. I was curious about, for those of you who haven't yet read Bryce's book, and Mariner is very much hoping you buy multiple copies for your loved ones, how you've thought about the texture of this book, of getting the italicized sections, for those of you in the audience, seem to bend much more towards nature, maybe even self-reflection, maybe writing to a future reader. We get that by the end with the daughter. I'm just curious where it almost read like almanacs to me, or weather reports in some ways. But that these sort of dispatches, where that came through for you in the process of this book. Did you write sort of the narrative and then insert these later? Did you have this sense the whole time, I need to step out?
Okay, you have laid your finger right at the end on something that I am pleased to talk about, but also slightly embarrassed by, which is that all three of my books have these italicized sections. Yes. You're absolutely right. In this case, they are intended for my daughter. And they became more that way as the book evolved. So as you get toward the end, it's more explicit. But on some very basic level, the existence of italicized chunks in my work comes from the sheer desperation that I feel after writing about my own life for that long. I just crave a second voice, and having those has always given me license to write, in something that approximates the third person, and to me to write all three books, and I kind of hope that they won't always be, but in this case, they of all the things that I've worked on, in this case, they make the most sense, because there is something about the transition between perceiving yourself at the end of a line, which is how I always thought of myself before my daughter showed up. You know, you think of yourself as like the culmination of all this stuff. And then there's this reframing, and it's like you're looking through the telescope the other way, you know. And for me, those italicized sections were, it opened a door to doing that was really necessary for me.
Well, Bryce, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you, and I just am so glad you're writing from this place in the American West, and looking forward to having your voice for many years to come. So thank you for being in conversation with me tonight.
Well, thank you for talking with me, and thank you, Nick, for having me too.
To you both, it was absolute pleasure to listen to your layered conversation, really getting at so many complexities and so much food for thought. It's a really wonderful book. I hope everyone will seek it out. Bryce, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and Taylor, thank you so much for really thoughtful, and I wouldn't call it interrogation, but beautiful, and beautiful commentary along the way. It's just a real pleasure, and we appreciate you having you with us this spring, Taylor. Bryce, thank you again, and thank you to Devon, who's behind the scenes helping run the show, and to all the audience who are here tonight. Hope you'll tune back in on June 3rd for Allison Cobb, and I'll be asking the questions then. All right, thanks to you both, and take good care, everyone. See you next time.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.